Welcome to the Tintin podcast, where we explore the adventures of Tintin, one story at a time. Whether you're a long-time fan of the books, or need just discovering the world of the boy reporter, this is the place for you. We'll be taking a deep dive into Hergé's iconic series, unpacking the stories, art, historical context, and everything else that makes Tintin a global phenomenon. Each episode will explore one of Tintin's adventures in detail, with plenty of trivia scattered right through. I'm Barun, and today we're following Tintin on his hunt for an artifact deep in the jungles of South America with the broken ear. Joining me today are old-timers Greg, Louisa, and Loki.
Hi, everybody.
Hi again.
Hi.
And Aaron from Canada, who, just like the rest of us, has been a lifelong fan of Tintin and his adventures.
How's it going, eh?
So, Greg, you were on the Blue Lotus pod, and since we're covering the series in order, how are things from your vantage point as we approach the broken ear?
Well, for me, and I'm really kind of living these sessions we're having here as memories of my childhood, primarily because, as I'll talk about a little bit, but the majority of my experience with Tintin ended by the time I was 12 or 13. And Blue Lotus, as Derek and I said, I had trouble finding. That was one of the last ones I read. And to be perfectly honest, I never looked at dates. I always thought because of the artwork, because it was just such a step up, that was probably one of the later books. And I believe that Broken Ear was one of the very first books I ever read. The thing that I think that connects them definitely is adventure. Hergé is learning to write. So.
And Loki, I suppose it's easy to connect the Blue Lotus with the pod you were last on, Cigars of the Pharaoh. But what do you make of this one on the other side, the broken ear?
Look, I think there are a few really key differences between this and the Blue Lotus that make it, significantly different. And I think it has its very own individual charms, even though Blue Lotus is seen as a real high point of the story. We see a really different villain in Mitsuharato and Ramon and Alonso, who are very self-interested and scheming. Mitsuharato, for all his kind of evil, was this, agent of the Japanese Empire. He wasn't necessarily out for personal gain like they are. And I think the other really key difference here and the key, evolution is he makes use of the MacGuffin in the story to really drive the narrative and push Tintin along for the first half until it becomes, less important once he arrives in San Theodoros and the ship sinks. But I think it has these really key differences that isolate Tintin and change the story. Even though it is in some ways a mystery, it's a much smaller scope in terms of this is not an international smuggling ring. This is just finding the mystery, finding the truth, which is a really key difference, and I think establishes a different side of Tintin.
One of the other differences is that San Theodoros is a fictional locale, and that's a break from tradition of Hergé sending Tintin to China or India or America or elsewhere. Aaron, what do you make of that?
Well, I've always found it kind of interesting because Hergé always wanted to go to exotic locales and, explore the cultures in the world. So I just find it funny that so early on he decides maybe he doesn't want to misrepresent a certain group of people or a country. So he creates this sort of fictional world, which for the longest time as a kid, I just thought they were in South America. And I didn't realize that San Theodoros was a fake place for the longest time. And so I find it interesting. Maybe it frees him up narratively that he can kind of create his own things and people can't accuse him of like, oh, you misrepresented a people. So I've always found that kind of interesting that he did that so early on.
It was really a thin veneer because, again, there was a war between Bolivia and Paraguay. It was over oil. And it was a very quick, well, I guess it wasn't quick, 3 years border war. So again, you see Hergé's reaching into some real life, but here, for whatever reason, he doesn't want to get directly involved.
And before we set sail for South America, we are home in Belgium. And if we pretend, Louisa, that the Soviets doesn't exist, which we do, that's Belgium and Tintin's home for the first time.
Yeah, I think it's, I especially adore it for that reason, actually, because any of us can relate to a story that begins in the comfort of our own home. And we get to see Tintin pulled from his domestic rituals which I love. They kind of mirror the Blue Lotus. He's like showing off his outfit and his calisthenics, which are very Eastern, um, and hinting that he has more cultural credibility, I think. Anyway, but I love that he is just totally at home, just like doing his little morning stretches, but he has this plaguing inability to leave mystery alone, like intrigue that has nothing to do with him. He's like, how can I solve this and get involved in this, global escapade or whatever. So yeah, it really helps us. It allows us to understand him as a person so much better than just watching him be dropped into an adventure because he's a reporter, seeing him like dragged away from the couch by something interesting. It's really fun.
Greg, pretty sure you didn't miss the Chinese poster on Tintin's wall either.
I did notice, and I noticed his outfit that he was wearing when he was doing his exercises. So that definitely stuck with me. And I too like seeing Tintin in his house. I mean, at times I can be a pretty literal person. I like just seeing characters grounded. What's their day like? What when they're done with their adventure, where do they go home to? And I also came across something interesting that this is 26 Labrador Road in Brussels, which is Tintin's home, up until Captain Haddock invites him to live with him in Marlinspike Hall at the end of Red Rackham's Treasure. So I always found that interesting that it's Brussels. And we'll get into this a little deeper, but to me, Tintin was always British or English. He was definitely not Belgian. And I did a little deeper look at when they did the UK versions, and they based the American versions off the UK versions. So I mean, there's just so many things in here that are so British. It's nothing like you would see on the continent. So including some of the old phrases in there. One time he mentions Uncle Tom Cobley and all right before he gets shot, and that's an old English saying. So anyway, I found that really interesting. That looking back on this, to me, again, Tintin was English. He was not Belgian.
Yeah, one more thing about his kind of opening scenes in Belgium, which I adore. I think I agree with Greg. I love seeing him grounded like that. But if you also think about like him hearing the bulletin on the radio and rushing down, interviewing the Thompsons, this is really the only recognizable journalistic work we see him do. Like, even though the work in Tintin in America and Tintin in the Congo and Soviets were somewhat similar to what some reporters did at that time in the world. Like, we don't have reporters like that anymore. No reporters just sent off to a country to report on it. So him doing some kind of investigative journalism, I really enjoy. I think he's like, this is him in my mind, and I think similar to Greg, this was one of the first ones I ever read. This is the beginning. Like, this could be his very first story. If you kind of ignore the artifacts from the Blue Lotus at the beginning, this is him hunting down a story, and maybe this is the one where he gets famous and gets to do all those other adventures and stuff because he was so successful in traipsing across South America on this journey. But I find that really grounds him as a character as well.
It's funny that you say that you always thought he was a British man, because as somebody who grew up reading them in French, and I knew that a lot of the stories took place in Belgium and France and all that, and because they all spoke French, it just, to me, I was like, oh yeah, he's from Belgium. Like, that just made sense to me. But watching, all like the movies and the TV shows and like any sort of English adaptation, I could definitely see why many people would interpret that as like him being like an Englishman, because it makes a lot of sense. And I think that just goes to the universality of the character, that you could really adapt him to pretty much any environment in that sense. And I think that's what makes him so appealing to like a worldwide audience. So it's really interesting to hear that.
I think it also goes to, or speaks to, the quality of the translation that was done by Michael Turner and Leslie Lonsdale Cooper. Like, they didn't do a literal translation. They did a very thoughtful translation of everything. Like, I know me as a child, my father was English, and he was very clear that no, Tintin is not English, because I think I also made that assumption. He's like, no, that's not where we're from. That's not what we're about. And he would point out quite specific things and be like, we don't do that here.
Yeah, they definitely anglicized it. I'm glad you pointed out that they decided not to do a word for word, and made it much more anglicized in several different ways. But I often wonder to myself now, I'd love to be able to read some different translations, something that might be closer to the original, to get I imagine I would get a very different perspective.
Back to the story itself, we know that Tintin is on the hunt for a stolen fetish, identifiable by its broken right ear, hence the title of the book. Back to you, Loki. Was that a good plot device to tie the story together, considering that large parts of the story itself pass by without the fetish being mentioned at all?
Like I mentioned earlier, that it's a MacGuffin. Like, it's not particularly for Tintin, and from our perspective, it's not intrinsically valuable. The director says that expressly at the beginning, and it kind of joins this lineage of rather pointless plot devices that just drive the narrative forward. But I think for us, it has this real symbolic significance because we've started Tintin not knowing, and Tintin being the only one who notices the difference. It has this kind of symbolic truth that Tintin is hunting down. Like, it's only at the very end where we find out the truth of it. And because it's established so strongly, and because we have this kind of motivation behind Tintin, that he's this truth seeker and this kind of mystery unraveler, it doesn't matter that it leaves the story for about a quarter or a third, somewhere in the middle, because we're so invested in Tintin, invested in his story at this point. And then, once he achieves that kind of relative safety, he resumes going back to find the truth about it. Once he's back in Europe, he almost stumbles across it, and we go, "Oh yeah, the fetish. What happened to it? This is what happened." And I think that kind of also relates to what what I mentioned in the Cigars of the Fair episode. And I think it's more resonant here, where he comes up against Alcazar and Ramon and Alonso. This kind of idealized, perfect kind of innocent masculinity that Tintin has is really shown throughout this story in this hunt for truth.
Yep, Ramon and Alonso also on the hunt for the fetish. Your take on them as villains, Aaron?
I thought overall, they were pretty good. I mean, they were compared to like the villains you would encounter later on. I find they are a tad silly, but I kind of like that because there's not a lot of comic relief in this story. So the fact that it comes from them and that they're the ones pursuing uh Tintin, I think, I don't know, just I always enjoyed it, it kind of they kind of take the buffoonery from Thompson and Thompson, which are just not really in this story. So I think it's a good balance between, like, we have all of the, like the implied violence in San Theodoros, and then it's just balanced with almost slapstick, which is what I really like about like the way these panels are drawn, because I just thought it was really good.
I like that you use slapstick. I'm trying to think. That's how I took it, I believe, when I was younger. But looking back on it now, when you think things targeted towards children, it was pretty violent, and Tintin, could you have a pistol in Brussels in the 1930s? Just stuff like that just makes me wonder. But
And in any era, can you get out of gunpoint by counting on a bolt of lightning?
Yeah, that lightning ball thing is really radical. I found that hard to believe, even as a kid, how many times I saw that lightning ball effect come in Tintin.
Overall, your take on the villains, Greg?
I thought he did okay with them. I thought that they played a great humor, kind of the fool role pretty well. So, and it's they were great because as I'll talk a little later too about it too. The big guys rarely get caught in this, so they're the perfect suckers to get nailed.
Can't help but remember Rastapopoulos when you say big guy who never gets caught. But Hergé decided to give him a rest for this book, Louisa. What do you think of that?
I think he's smart to do that, to leave him out, because the world is a big place and it makes zero sense. I know that I think about things a little bit too literally and logically for a comic, but I do think He's trying to make a little bit of sense, and it would just make absolutely zero sense for Tintin to encounter 100% of all the people he's ever met in his other adventures in every adventure. So Hergé is too intelligent, and at this point in his career, I think he's deliberately modeling reality more than not. And also setting some characters aside for later is the best way to cook up fresh ones, devoid of the old ties to the old plots, while still leaving his options open to return to those OG players if needed. I kind of like the way he's playing with leaving people out, and even Thompson and Thompson, just like introducing them a little tiny bit at the beginning, which is a little weird. It's realistic, I think, to render them only periodically and in logical spaces, especially early on when they're not even friends yet. They just become like really good friends and like go to the moon together later on. But they're in the beginning, they're just side roles that serve the plot. So I think it's realism.
And you have a strong view on the Thompsons in this regard, Lockie.
Yeah, I find it tiresome when they're kind of illogically forced into the story, like explorers on the moon, which I know some people are going to find quite blasphemous. I think this is a really good
I'm going to
balance.
come at you on that pod.
Like they, this is the perfect balance. I think they enter, they bumble the case, they leave. You see them kind of on international missions at different points in time, but I think it really would have stretched it here, and I think this just feels right. They have a short but powerful role in the story.
Aaron, do you agree?
Yes and no. Like I kind of touched on this a bit earlier. They were always the comic relief, at least that's how I always interpreted them. They always seemed to more get in the way than actually help. So, but I always enjoyed that. But having two similar characters that are actually the villains, I think actually kind of filled that void. So while I do think that it did kind of like this is also very early on and they hadn't really been established yet. So it was sort of like maybe starting off with the familiarity, kind of like starting in his home and then going off on an adventure. I think it's more of just an extension of that. It's like, okay, we're going away from the familiar and we're going to go to a brand new place. And really, realistically, there was no reason for the Thompsons to actually follow him to San Theodorus. The later books, they're always around. They always have a reason. It's because, people like the characters and it's what happens. But overall, I think the cameo is fun and we get sort of their comic relief later through two different characters. So I think they were used adequately, especially for this early in the series.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if I was correct in noticing, is this the first use of when, I don't know if it's Thompson with a P or Thompson without a P, says to be precise, he repeats the other Thompson statement, said to be precise, and then he reverses the sentence like the one on page 3 where he says anonymous letters nobody wrote, so that's definitely something that comes back a lot of times in other issues. One Thompson says something and then the other one repeats him with to be precise and then totally messes it up. So that's the first time I think we've read it. But anyone can correct me if I'm wrong.
I thought maybe they have a little of that in their first appearance. Yeah, I think they do. Maybe I'm wrong. I thought I read them doing a little of that wordplay. I'll have to dig up cigars again.
Either way, it's great to see it coming out. I definitely remember that as one of the things I loved.
But it's not all good news. One of the things I didn't love in this book was the art. And Lockie, I can see you have some notes on this. What explains the decline in the quality of the art as the book progresses? By page 52, for example, which is when Tintin runs into Richwell the Explorer, we are down to a single shade of green to depict the forest in the background.
Yeah, so doing a little reading on this was the first volume that was revised and recolored for album printing, but it was also written when RJ was largely working by himself. Cheng Jonren helped him on the Blue Lotus, but then going back to the Broken Ear, RJ is by himself, and then Studio Hergé, which started up in 1950 to support his work and to recolor previous titles and redo artwork, which we'll see, when we talk about the Black Island in the next episode, hadn't been established. So he was doing this by himself, and I think he's almost I don't want to say one way or the other, but it seems as though it's almost laziness or he's rushing towards a production deadline. But he also apparently left a lot of the coloring work in those later editions to other artists because they were just better at it. He was not a strong colorist. He never really fully grasped it. And for the entirety of his career, as we see in the published versions of Alf art, he worked in black and white still. Like he was just doing the Linclair line drawing and was relying on the rest of his studio to do that colored background. So I think that's a key part of it.
Aaron?
It's a very interesting observation because honestly, I have never noticed that. And it's interesting to look at because I would have just seen it as like, oh, maybe he just wants to focus the artwork and like it doesn't really matter what's going on in the background because the focus is the characters in front. But so it's just kind of funny. So it's almost like I'm seeing it for the first time now. It's kind of funny. But I always like because I read a lot of this type of stuff, so I just figured like comics are all about like trying to focus the reader's attention to what's the most important, and I just always took it as, oh yeah, so they're in the jungle that's kind of established, and sometimes artists get lazy and they're like, I don't need to draw leaves. You know what a jungle looks like. So
it's also a good time to remind our listeners that Aaron has read these books in French. And so who better to ask this question, Aaron? What is an aide de camp? And overall, did you like Tintin's transition to becoming a colonel in the story?
An aide de camp or aide de camp is basically just a personal assistant. And basically, yeah, so he's still a high-ranking officer, but he's at the beck and call of General Alcazar. It's a real thing in the military, so I thought that was kind of cool. But him becoming a colonel, I actually completely forgot about, and it reminds me like it's a very early trope I find where he finds himself in these weird situations. Like I think in the Congo, he ends up like putting on the skin of an ape to escape stuff. It's been a while since I've read that, but like there's like all these like comparatively like all these sillier moments. So like him just becoming a colonel didn't seem out of place for like an earlier story because they were kind of like this heightened reality type thing. But like for later on, like I don't ever see that happening because it doesn't really ever happen. Especially by the time like Captain Haddock is introduced and all that, like I find they become more grounded in that sense. It's still, yeah.
As for him getting drunk, Louisa, realistic or out of place?
I think it's both. Tintin is sobriety incarnate, and we know and we trust him to be boozeless unless other circumstances force it upon him. So it would be in his most perilous moment, would be the only time that he would get drunk. And it's like, it would be interesting to count up the exact number of times he has a gun to his head and the trigger is not pulled or something happens at the last second. But it's just proving that I guess it's not an extreme circumstance for Tintin necessarily in that case. It happens a lot. But in this one, it's like, I think it just proves that he was like, he believed he was about to die because that's the only way we would see our hero drunk. And either way, I think it's fulfilling to us for the plot and as sober readers to see how foolish Tintin is and how he doesn't even he doesn't even remember becoming a military general. He doesn't. Yeah. Anyway, it's like a little bit realistic that he, even like the perfect protagonist, can become a miserable idiot when drinking is involved.
And Greg, thoughts on R.W. Trickler? In other words, were there digs on American capitalism again, just like in Tintin in America?
Yeah, so there was some of those guys that we saw from Tintin in America, sort of. But it is interesting to sort of go back to the history that it was Standard Oil versus Royal Dutch Shell in the real life situation here, and there's lots of questions about what they were doing in the area at that time in the 30s. So it's it's not that far out of from reality. I think it's a statement as much about American and European businessmen as it is. You see that arms dealer coming in and he's selling to both sides, and it was like they all knew each other and they've been through this before. So I think you catch up a lot of the feelings of the public coming off the heels of World War One. And the incredible transformation and sacrifices that populations made. Anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with Greg. I think it's both this almost like imperialistic capitalism that's generated from both Europe and America. I didn't necessarily read Trickler as American. I find it really interesting. Like in my mind, he actually looks a bit like J.M. Dawson, who I'd always assumed was British because of his involvement in the international zone. But Basil Bazarov, I think, is a really interesting character because it's this really specific repudiation of a real person, Basil Zaharov, who was called the Merchant of Death, and he was a well-known arms dealer. I don't think he was literally or like actually involved in the Grand Chaco War, whereas here he's involved in the Grand Chaco War, but he sold arms to both sides of many conflicts throughout early 20th century Europe. And I believe RJ learned about him, and Aaron, you can tell me if the pronunciation is wrong. This magazine called La Crapule, which was like the mortar shell, which was started by soldiers from World War One who were really kind of just anti-authoritarian, and RJ was a subscriber. But yeah, this Bazarov character, he kind of shamelessly deals in death to both sides. He has no morals. He has no kind of ideology. He just lounges in luxury in his private plane, which at the time was an insane luxury. And then he just very casually works to have Tintin killed. Like, it's quite chilling. Because I'm sure, if Pablo didn't rescue him, Tintin would have been in front of another firing squad the following day. I think when we're talking about characters and character introduction, we can't discount General Alcazar, who becomes a recurring character in several narratives, and he presents this really kind of juxtaposed version of like I guess like this kind of really alpha male type character, but he's a massive buffoon, particularly in this story. But later, who reveals himself as really corrupt and really easily swayed, and he really contrasts against Tintin's kind of upstanding morality. Like Louisa mentioned that he was such a sober character, but he's also just such a good character. Like Tintin is so principled, he immediately brushes off Trickler, and in this case, against Alcazar, it makes Alcazar look ridiculous and kind of pulls the wind and kind of pompousness out of all these types of these strongmen, military leaders who are again growing in power in South America, but they're also growing in power in America, in Europe as well. And I think that's a really powerful character that RJ kept going back to. So even though we don't have Rastapopoulos here, we have another, I would say, almost equally important character established.
I think this early on, we're still in the point of where, like General Alcazar, I like where that character eventually goes. But you're right, in this issue, he's not a very positive person. He's not somebody you look up to at all. But again, the character wasn't really developed yet. I think Hergé is still being a little lazy. He's relying on some generalizations, relying on some tropes. He's got the absent-minded professor in there, and he's nearsighted or farsighted or whatever, and acting the fool and things like that. But I think that again, this is where his storytelling picks up as the background and your context for the characters is included, and he relies less on those, I think, those broad generalizations of people, because I think this would be a fascinating study to take a look at, see these different literary tropes and media tropes from this time period to today, even, and how these readings it bled into my understandings in the 80s and 90s, even, especially if you look at the wars in Central America in the 80s. A lot of these things came to the fore for me as I was thinking about it. But again, going back to the literary side of thing, they're just real strong. I think literary tropes and devices that have been used for a long period of time.
Yeah, and those tropes match Alcazar perfectly. Power is temporary, but ego is forever.
Yeah, he's a third world dictator. Even when they're good, they're bad.
And regular listeners to the pod know that we always save our favorite character for last. A word in Snowy, Loki?
Yeah, for me, I think it's a really strong Snowy performance. I was interested to see that some people kind of talking about this in the Black Island, where he doesn't, I don't know, maybe he's not as heroic, but I think he's really fun. He actually has to be saved for a few times, but in those early scenes in Belgium, like he's really cheeky to Tintin. Like he kind of mocks him calls him Sherlock Holmes. He makes fun of him for crashing into the light post, and then he crashes into the dustbin himself. It's yeah, there's a lot of humor in Snowy in this, which I think really is enjoyable, instead of him being this kind of furry damsel in distress a lot of the time, or him rescuing Tintin. It shows them as buddies.
Louisa?
Oh, I think when I was younger, I really missed his role in this. Snowy, other than him like losing that little bit of his tail and kind of getting beaten up by a parrot, I kind of overlooked his importance in this. But yeah, no, it is a good role for Snowy.
And as somebody who's been part of our pod since the Soviets, your final thoughts on the Broken Year?
Yeah, I cataloged this one among the other greats, but I'm also the least bit picky. After the first two books, when he starts to try to replace that racism with cultural integrity, and I mean, it's not perfect. But I think this one has gems all its own, especially in Alonso and Ramon and their hellbound demise. I think this is the only time when we actually like see hell and demons as a part of it, and it doesn't even feel like fully religious. It just feels like they are the right characters to appreciate hell or to deserve hell. And I just think that so there's something about the surreality of that that you don't really find except here and there in other Tintins, and that makes it really special to me. As well as the parrot character, which I really like, and how an animal like outs a killer. There's some definite unique qualities to the Broken Ear, so I put it right up there with the Blue Lotus.
I love the parrot too, so caramba, let's have some questions. Aaron, this one is for you. Why does the 1991 Ellipse and Elvana adaptation of The Broken Ear do away with several elements of the story? From the oil war subplot to Ramon and Alonso's deaths to even Tintin's drunk escapade.
I think that mainly had to do with the fact that the show was primarily produced for children, and while they had to condense these books into, I think each book was 2 half-hour episodes, so they had to cut a lot of things to sort of streamline it. But also, cutting out the drinking is obviously for the kids. They don't want to show the character engaging in that type of activity, but also I think a lot of the political stuff would have gone over a lot of the audience's head, and if they were to include it, maybe some viewers, like some young kids, would just find it boring. So I think it had to do a lot with just the art of adaptation, but also it's like, well, like a 7-year-old watching this is not really going to care about that. They just want to see the adventure. And I actually rewatched that. It's funny that you mention that, and I felt it still worked. Obviously it felt like after reading the story, I was like, oh, it's missing a lot of that, but I felt the story still worked because at its core the story was about the MacGuffin chase, and trying to figure out the mystery. It's a very universal story trope. So yeah, I think it's just how they adapted the story.
Greg, how much has South America changed since the days of the Broken Year?
In some ways, it's radically different. In some ways, it's, unfortunately the same. I think you still have a pretty wide split between the urban areas and rural areas and things like that. But obviously the culture is still there. It's if anything, it's only grown since that time. So it's a continent of really vibrant nations.
And Louisa and Loki fast forward to Tintin and the Picaros, and lo and behold, the setting is San Theodoros, and it features Generals Alcazar and Tapioca, and the explorer Ridgewell. So do you consider that book as a sequel of sorts to The Broken Year?
Oh, I don't know if it's right next to it in my collection, but I do think it is a sequel. And I think The Seven Crystal Balls is also a sequel. But for that matter, perhaps all the books kind of feed into each other, since it's consistently reinforced that everyone enjoys the same universe and a global landscape akin to our own. So really, it's just like it's all blending together. It's a series, so I really believe they all build on each other and are distinctly different, but also united. So it's like a sequel and then more.
Yeah, I think similar to what I was saying about Alcazar earlier, who kind of evolves as the story goes on. This is an evolution in Hergé's kind of criticism of the broken political systems around the world, but particularly in South America. He's much more explicit in his critique of that corporate interventionism. Like we see Loch Lomond, who are clearly supporting one side of the revolution. They're undermining the Picaros. And I know that it's, not everyone's favorite Picaro, but in some ways Picaros feels a lot like Red Sea Sharks, where he touches on all these elements and brings them in from that Middle Eastern sense. This feels like the same way, that kind of soft sequel that draws on a lot of what's happened previously, revisiting classic characters in new settings and kind of updating it. So yes, I agree. It's very much a sequel to this, and I think in some ways it's just as good and possibly more incisive in its kind of political criticisms.
And Aaron, the crystal balls are all yours.
Well, overall, I did think it was a pretty good one, but considering like he has later stories set in sort of the same area, I don't find this one is as good. I still think it's just as good because, we're introduced to General Alcazar and we go to it's the first time a fictional place is visited, something that Hergé will do again with Sildavia, and like I think it's okay. I don't think it's the best one, but I do think it's still worth the read. I'm gonna give this 5 out of 7 crystal balls.
And that's a wrap on our journey through The Broken Year. This adventure took Tintin deep into political conspiracies, art theft, and South American revolutions, blending satire with high-stakes action. Next up, we're venturing to the misty shores of Scotland in the Black Island, a mysterious island that locals fear to tread. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe as we continue our journey through the Tintin podcast.